On the 5th of August, 2002, a man stood in his doorway in the little English town of Soham and told a television camera that he was the last person to see two missing girls alive. He spoke calmly. He crossed his arms. He told the reporter that Holly and Jessica had stopped by his house the evening before, asked after his girlfriend, and then walked off towards the library. He looked for all the world like a concerned neighbor trying to help. That man was Ian Huntley, 28 years old, the caretaker at Soham Village College, and both girls were already dead when he said those words. He had killed them the previous evening inside the house he was standing in front of. The camera that was supposed to help find Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman was pointed directly at the man who had taken them, and neither the reporter nor the audience knew it. I want you to hold that image a killer framed in his own doorway performing concern for a national audience, because it is the shape of this entire episode. 3 cases. 3 killers. And in each one, the person who should have been running from the investigation was instead running toward it, offering help that nobody had asked for and nobody thought to refuse. The question these cases leave behind is not how killers hide. It is what happens when they don't hide at all, when they stand in the light and the light makes them invisible. Let me take you back a day to the afternoon it began. Sunday the 4th of August was warm and bright, and 10-year-olds Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had spent it at a family barbecue at Holly's house on Red House Gardens. Around 6:30, still in the matching red Manchester United shirts they'd put on. That morning the 2 girls walked out to buy sweets. They were best friends. They had been since nursery. Holly's father would later say he wasn't worried at first. 2 girls walking to the shop in a small, safe town was nothing unusual. It became unusual when they didn't come back. A search began almost immediately, and within hours it was enormous. Soham is a close, tight community in the Cambridgeshire Fenlands, the kind of place where most people know most other people, and the idea that 2 children could vanish from its streets in broad daylight was unthinkable. Hundreds of volunteers fanned out across the town and the surrounding countryside. Posters went up. The police launched a major inquiry. And very quickly, a young man with neat hair and a steady voice appeared at the edge of the search offering what seemed like the most useful piece of information anyone had. He had seen the girls. He knew where they'd been heading. He was glad to help. And here is where I need to slow down and tell you what a journalist saw that nobody else did, because it is the hinge. The whole first act turns on. Brian Farmer, a reporter for the Press Association covering the disappearance, went to interview Huntley after police released a timeline of the girls' last known movements. Huntley was cooperative, detailed, and calm. Too calm. Farmer listened, asked his questions, left, and then did something that most reporters wouldn't. He called Cambridgeshire police. He told them something about Huntley's story felt wrong. Not factually wrong. Farmer couldn't point to a lie, but the shape of it, the smoothness. The way Huntley volunteered information without being pressed felt rehearsed in a way that genuine memory never does. I want to be fair about this because being fair, even about the moments that make your skin crawl, is the whole job. What Farmer noticed was not evidence. It was instinct. And instinct is not a conviction. If Huntley had turned out to be innocent, that same phone call would have been an ordinary dead end in an ordinary investigation. The reason it matters is only because of what came after, and I'm telling you about it not to lionize a reporter's gut feeling, but to point at something deeper that in a town full of people looking a man whose job was to listen heard a wrong note. Not in what Huntley said. in how easily he said it. The police, to their credit, had already begun watching him. Not because of Farmer alone, Huntley had placed himself at the scene, which made him a routine person of interest, but also because his behavior kept drawing attention. He lingered around the search. He asked questions of officers. He showed an emotional involvement that, in the careful language investigators would later use, seemed disproportionate for a man who claimed to barely know the girls. Huntley's house was searched as procedure required to eliminate him as a suspect. Nothing was found. But Huntley's girlfriend was another matter. Maxine Carr, 25, was a teaching assistant at the girls' primary school. She knew Holly and Jessica personally, and she told police she had been home with Huntley on the night the girls disappeared. That alibi would eventually collapse. Carr had been in Grimsby visiting her mother that entire weekend. She was not in Soham. She could not have seen what Huntley did or didn't do that evening. Whether she knew when she lied what she was covering for that question has never been fully settled, and I'm not going to pretend it has. She was convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. She was not charged with murder. The distance between those two things is the space in which her guilt or her ignorance lives, and honest people disagree about which one fills it. 13 days after the girls vanished, two things happened on the same afternoon. Officers found the half-burned remains of 2 red Manchester United shirts in a bin at the school where Huntley worked. And a gamekeeper miles away near the RAF Lakenheath Air Base in Suffolk found 2 bodies in an irrigation ditch, badly decomposed but identifiable. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had most likely been asphyxiated. Their bodies were too degraded to determine whether they had been sexually assaulted, and I'll leave that uncertainty exactly where it is. Huntley was arrested that evening. Carr was arrested with him. And a neighbor of Carr's mother in Grimsby would later give a statement that hangs over the whole case like a photograph you wish you hadn't seen. Days before the arrests, she had watched Huntley and Carr standing at the open boot of their car. Huntley was pale and shaking, staring into the boot. Carr stood beside him, her head bowed, weeping. When Huntley noticed the neighbor watching, he slammed it shut. I am not going to tell you what was in that boot, because no one officially established it in court, and I will not turn an assumption into a fact, no matter how strong the assumption is. What I will tell you is this: a man who had stood before a camera, looking calm and helpful, was in another moment white-faced and trembling over an open car boot. Hold those 2 images side by side. That is the distance between performance and reality, in this case. And it is the whole lesson. But here is the turn that lifts this beyond a single terrible crime and into something that should genuinely frighten you. After the conviction, after Huntley received 2 life sentences, with a minimum of 40 years, a public inquiry called the Bichard Inquiry tore through the systems that had let him anywhere near a school. And what it found was a catalogue of failure so thorough it reads less like negligence and more like design. Huntley had been reported to police in Humberside multiple times for sexual offenses against underage girls before he ever set foot in Soham. None of those complaints had led to a conviction, and so under the rules as they existed then, the records were destroyed, wiped clean. When he applied for the caretaker's job at Soham Village College under the name Ian Nixon, Cambridgeshire police ran a background check on the name he'd given. They did not check the name he'd been born with, even though it was written on the same application form. The school's principal later admitted he hadn't checked Huntley's references. A man with a documented history of predatory behavior toward children was handed the keys to a school, and every gate that should have stopped him had been left open. I'll say this once plainly, and then we'll move on. The system did not fail Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman on the night they died. It failed them months earlier in an office when someone decided that an accusation without a conviction was the same as no accusation at all and fed the file to a shredder. Ian Huntley was not a mastermind who fooled a nation. He was a man who walked through open doors. And the most sickening door he walked through was the one in front of a television camera, where he offered his help to a country that was already, without knowing it, looking straight at him. It would be easy sitting here to think the lesson of Soham is about television, about the danger of putting a microphone in front of the wrong person, and if it were only that, it would be uncomfortable but containable. A media problem. A procedural gap. Fixable. But what if the performance isn't aimed at a camera at all? What if it's aimed at the people who carry badges and know the case files? And what if it works not for 13 days but for months, face-to-face, night after night, over beers? For that, we need to leave England and go to California, to a bar stool in Santa Cruz in the early 1970s, and to a very large man that everybody liked. There was a place in Santa Cruz, California, in the early 70s called the Jury Room. It was a bar near the county courthouse, the kind of place where off-duty cops would unwind after a shift. Nothing fancy, dim lights, cheap drinks, familiar faces. And one of the most familiar faces in that bar, a man the regulars had come to know and like, was a 24-year-old named Edmund Kemper. They called him Big Ed. He was hard to miss. 6'9", close to 300 pounds, soft-spoken, polite, surprisingly funny. He bought rounds. He asked about their work. He listened with what everyone took for genuine interest as the officers talked about the cases they were running, the leads they were chasing, the pressure they were under. And the case that dominated every conversation in that bar, in those months, was the one the newspapers had named the co-ed killer. Someone was abducting and murdering young female hitchhikers along the highways around Santa Cruz, and the police had no idea who he was. Big Ed sat with them through all of it. He nodded. He sympathized. He asked the kind of questions a thoughtful civilian might ask. How's the investigation going? Any leads must be tough. And then he'd finish his drink, say goodnight, and drive home. I am going to tell you what was in his car on some of those drives home. And I need you to understand that I am not telling you for shock. I am telling you because without it, you cannot understand the size of the lie that was sitting on that bar stool. Edmund Kemper, between May 1972 and April 1973, murdered 6 young women college students, most of them hitchhiking, along with his own mother and her closest friend. I am going to handle the details the way they deserve to be handled, which is briefly and without spectacle. He picked up hitchhikers in his car, drove them to isolated places, and killed them. What he did to the bodies afterward is extensively documented, and I am not going to recite it, because reciting it would be for your discomfort, not your understanding. What matters here is not the method. What matters is the timeline. Because on some of the evenings that Kemper sat in the jury room, smiling, buying around, asking how the hunt for the co-ed killer was going, he had already killed, and the officers he was buying drinks for were the ones looking for him. Let that land for a moment. Not because it's dramatic, because it's the point. Ian Huntley stood in front of a camera for a few minutes and performed concern for strangers. Edmund Kemper sat down at a table for months, and performed friendship with the very men whose job was to stop him. The camera is a surface. The bar stool is intimate, and the intimacy is what made it work not as a strategy of genius, but as something far simpler and more unsettling. FBI profiler John Douglas, who later studied Kemper extensively, put it in terms that cut straight to the bone. Kemper went to police bars because it gave him a feeling of power, the thrill of being an insider, of being close to authority. But more than that, Douglas said it gave him a direct line into the progress of the investigation. He could hear what the police knew and what they didn't. He could adjust. He could anticipate. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was sitting in the light, and the light was the safest place he could possibly be because nobody looks for a killer among friends. Now let me go back and tell you how this man came to be sitting on that stool, because the history matters, and it is worse than you think. Edmund Kemper did not begin killing in 1972. He began in 1964 when he was 15 years old. He shot his grandmother in the head, and when asked why, he said he wanted to see what it felt like. Then he shot his grandfather because he thought the old man would be angry about the grandmother. For this, he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane, where he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and classified as, in the clinical language of the time, an extreme sociopath with a high probability of reoffending. And here is the first silence in this story, and it is an institutional one. The psychiatrists at Atascadero recommended in writing that Kemper should not be released into the custody of his mother. The relationship was toxic, they said. She had been emotionally abusive, they said. It would be dangerous. Kemper was released into the custody of his mother. He was 21. His juvenile criminal record, the double homicide of his grandparents, was sealed and then expunged. On paper, the man who walked out of Atascadero was no one. A clean name, a fresh start. A 6'9" blank page. I'm going to be honest with you about how I want you to hold that fact because it shapes everything that follows, and it would be easy to misuse. It is not an excuse. Nothing is an excuse for what Kemper did. But it is a question aimed not at him, but at every office and every official who signed the papers. A system that knew what he was, that had written down what he was, chose to release him into the one environment its own experts had specifically warned against. That is not a gap. That is a decision. And the 6 women who would die in the next few years were not yet names in any file. They were alive, going to class thumbing rides on the Pacific Coast Highway, having no idea that the system meant to protect them had just opened a door and waved the danger through. By 1972, Kemper had moved to Santa Cruz, where his mother worked at the University of California. He had applied to become a state trooper and been rejected too tall, too heavy. But that rejection didn't end his fascination with law enforcement. It redirected it. One officer gave him a training school badge. Another lent him a gun. He drove a car that looked like a police cruiser. He absorbed the culture, the jargon, the body language. And then he walked into the jury room and became to everyone there just a big, friendly guy who liked cops. I want to pause on one thing about those months, because it is the detail that separates this case from the kind of serial killer story that gets turned into a Netflix special and stripped of its meaning. The officers in that bar were not fools. They were working a case under enormous pressure in a city that was terrified. Santa Cruz in the early 70s was drowning in violence. 3 separate serial killers were active in the area within the same window, an almost unprecedented clustering that strained every resource the department had. These were competent people doing an impossible job. And the reason Kemper fooled them was not that they were bad at their work. It was that nothing in their training or their experience had prepared them for the possibility that the killer they were hunting would sit down across from them, buy a round, and ask how their day was. The armor of friendliness is the hardest armor to see through, because seeing through it requires you to distrust kindness, and most decent people are not built to do that. And then comes the night that the whole story turns on, and it is so strange it almost reads like fiction. On Good Friday, 1973, Kemper killed his mother with a claw hammer in her apartment. What he did to her body afterward, I will not describe. You can find it in the record if you need to, and I won't put it in your ears for effect. After killing her, he went out to the jury room and drank with his friends, the police officers. He came back. He called his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, invited her over for dinner. When she arrived, he strangled her. He put both bodies in closets, left a note, and drove east. He drove for 3 days straight, taking caffeine pills all the way to Pueblo, Colorado, with 3 guns and 200 rounds of ammunition in the car. And from a phone booth in Pueblo, he called the Santa Cruz police and told them everything. They did not believe him. I need you to sit with that, because it is the sentence this entire case exists to deliver. Edmund Kemper. The co-ed killer called the police department, whose officers he had been drinking with for months, told them plainly that he had committed the murders they had been investigating, and they thought it was a joke. They thought Big Ed was pulling a prank. He had to call back multiple times. He had to give details that only the killer would know. It took several calls before anyone agreed to send a car. That is not a failure of policing. That is the sound of trust, real human earned trust colliding with a truth it cannot absorb. The officers liked Kemper. They had sat across from him, laughed with him, relaxed around him. The suggestion that he was the monster they'd been hunting was not just unlikely to them. It was offensive. It violated something personal. And that violation, the betrayal, not of a system but of a friendship, is the thing Kemper had been feeding on the whole time. He didn't need an alibi. He had something better. He had their affection. I'll end this one where it deserves to end. Edmund Kemper was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder and asked the judge to sentence him to death by torture. Capital punishment was suspended in California at the time. He received 8 concurrent life sentences. He is, as of now, still alive in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. And here is the question this case leaves behind, the one that doesn't have a comfortable answer. Every safety system in the world is built on the assumption that the dangerous person is the one who avoids contact, who lurks at the edges, who runs. Kemper walked toward. He leaned in. He made himself indispensable to the very people hunting him, and the warmth he gave off was real enough to make hardened detectives refuse to believe the truth when it was spoken to them in plain words. How do you build a system that accounts for that? How do you tell good people to distrust the man who buys them a drink? You probably can't, and that's the honest answer. Johnson here, quick pause before the last case because it's the one I've spent the most time sitting with, and it's the heaviest. If these are worth something to you, the subscribe and the bell genuinely help them get made. Drop a case in the comments if there's one you want me to take on. Now let me set up the last one because it changes the scale of everything we've been talking about. Huntley performed concern for a camera. Kemper performed friendship for the officers hunting him. Both of those are, in the end, performances aimed at avoiding detection, at staying free. The last case asks a different question entirely. What happens when a killer doesn't just hide among the people looking for him, but steps into a courtroom, raises his right hand, and uses the machinery of justice itself to put someone else in the ground for his crime? For that, we go to London, to a terraced house in Notting Hill, and to a quiet man on the ground floor that everyone thought they could trust. At number 10, Rillington Place in the Notting Hill district of London, there lived a man who could not have seemed less dangerous if he had tried. John Reginald Halliday Christie was middle-aged, bespectacled, softly spoken. He had served as a reserve constable during the war, a volunteer policeman entrusted with the safety of his neighbors during the Blitz. He lived quietly with his wife Ethel in the ground-floor flat. He spoke in measured tones. He was to anyone who met him the picture of dull English respectability. Beneath the floorboards of his front room, his wife's body was decomposing. In the kitchen wall, papered over 3 women were entombed. In the garden, 2 more had been buried for years. A human skull had been found by children playing on a nearby bomb site, and never connected to his address. A human bone was propping up his garden fence in plain view of anyone who walked past. John Christie murdered at least 8 people over the course of a decade, inside a house where other families lived in a street where neighbors chatted and children played and nobody knew. But that is not why this case is here. If that were all a serial killer who hid his crimes behind a respectable front, it would be a London horror story and nothing more. Christie is here because of what he did with that respectability. He did not merely use it to avoid suspicion. He weaponized it. He walked into a courtroom, took the witness stand, and helped the British state hang an innocent man for a crime that Christie himself had committed. I need to introduce you to Timothy Evans because his life and death are the center of this story, and telling it honestly means telling you who he was, not who you might wish he had been. Evans was 25, Welsh working class, barely literate. He had a low IQ, a tendency to make up stories about himself to feel important, and a temper he often lost. He was not a good husband. He and his wife Beryl argued constantly about money, about his drinking, about her housekeeping. The neighbors heard the fights through the thin walls. He had a documented history of hitting her. I am telling you this not to diminish him, but because it matters enormously to what happened next. When the police came to choose between Timothy Evans's word and John Christie's, everything about Evans, his class, his literacy, his temper, his habit of lying, made him easy to disbelieve. And everything about Christie, his manner, his war service, his calm, steady voice made him easy to trust. That asymmetry is the whole machine. Every gear in it runs on the assumption that respectability and truthfulness are the same thing. In 1948, Evans and Beryl moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place with their infant daughter Geraldine. The house was cramped, grimy. The Christies occupied the ground floor, and the families crossed paths daily. By late 1949, Beryl was pregnant again. They couldn't afford another child. They could barely afford the one they had. And here is where Christie steps in. And I want you to watch what he does, because the pattern of it, the slow, careful positioning of himself as the person to trust, is the same pattern that will carry him all the way into the witness box. Christie told Evans that he had medical knowledge. He offered to help Beryl with an abortion illegal in Britain at the time, and dangerous. Evans, desperate, agreed. He went to work and left his wife in the care of the quiet, respectable man downstairs. When Evans came home, Christie told him Beryl was dead. The abortion had gone wrong, Christie said. She had died on the makeshift operating table. And then Christie said the thing that sealed Timothy Evans's fate. He told Evans to leave London, that he, Christie, would take care of the baby, that he'd find a good family to look after Geraldine, that it would all be handled. Evans panicked, not knowing what else to do, fled to Wales. "I need to stop here and be straight with you about what we know and what we don't, because this is the kind of moment where a careless telling does real damage. We know that Beryl Evans died by strangulation. We know that baby Geraldine died by strangulation." Christie later confessed to killing Beryl, and although he denied killing the baby, he is widely, almost universally believed to have killed her as well. But whether Evans played any role at all in either death has been debated for 70 years, and the honest position is that the evidence points overwhelmingly toward Christie and away from Evans, but overwhelmingly is not beyond all doubt, and I owe you that distinction. What happened next is the judicial equivalent of a building collapsing in slow motion. Evans in Wales walked into a police station and tried to confess, but his confessions kept changing. First, he said he'd given Beryl something to drink, and she died. Then he said Christie had performed the abortion and killed her. Then, under pressure, he allegedly said he was responsible for both deaths. A confession that legal scholars have since argued bears all the hallmarks of a false statement extracted from a frightened, exhausted man who could barely read the document he was signing. And here is the door that Christie walked through. When it came to trial, Christie, the quiet ex-constable, the respectable neighbor, took the witness stand as the prosecution's key witness. He was calm. He was measured. He denied any involvement. He told the court his version of events in the steady, careful voice of a man who had nothing to hide. And across the courtroom, Timothy Evans Young, poor, uneducated, with a history of lying and a temper the whole street had heard said from the dock that Christie was the killer. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. They convicted Evans of murdering his daughter. He was sentenced to death. I want you to sit with that deliberation time, because it tells you everything about how lopsided the contest was. 40 minutes. Not 40 hours, not 40 days of agonized doubt. 40 minutes to choose between a stammering young man who couldn't keep his story straight and a calm, respectable pillar of the community who sat on the witness stand like he belonged there. If you had been on that jury with no knowledge of what would come to light 3 years later, I cannot honestly tell you that you would have decided differently. And that is the most frightening thing about this case, not that the system was corrupt, but that it worked exactly the way it was designed to work, and it killed an innocent man. Timothy Evans was hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 9th of March, 1950. He maintained his innocence until the rope went around his neck. The hangman was Albert Pierre Point Britton's chief executioner, and for 3 years after that, John Christie kept killing. In December 1952, he strangled his wife Ethel and buried her beneath the floorboards. Over the following months, he murdered 3 more women, gassing them unconscious before strangling them, and sealed their bodies into an alcove in the kitchen, which he papered over. Then quietly, he moved out and sublet the flat. On the 24th of March, 1953, the new tenant pulled back a corner of loose wallpaper in the kitchen and found a body, then another, then a third. The police came. They found Ethel under the floorboards. They found 2 more women in the garden. And the whole careful, quiet, respectable world of John Reginald Halliday Christie came apart like wet paper. Christie was arrested, tried, and convicted of his wife's murder. He confessed to killing Beryl Evans. He did not confess to killing the baby, but by that point, no one with any sense believed him about anything. And here's the detail I need you to carry, the one that sits at the bottom of this case, like a stone. John Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 15th of July, 1953, by Albert Pierrepoint. The same hangman, the same prison, the same room. 3 years apart, Pierrepoint had pulled the lever for the innocent man, and the guilty one in the same place with the same rope. And the only difference between the two mornings was that one of them was a murder committed by the state. I'll say that once. We won't circle back to it. The fallout was enormous, slow, and bitterly fought. An official inquiry in 1953 rushed through before Christie's execution concluded against mounting public skepticism that Evans had been rightly convicted. It took Ludovic Kennedy's devastating 1961 book 10 Rillington Place to force the case back open. Evans was granted a royal pardon in 1966. And in 2003, more than half a century after the hanging, the British government formally acknowledged that the conviction and execution of Timothy Evans was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice. His name was cleared. It had only taken 53 years. The Evans case is cited by virtually every historian of British law as one of the principal reasons the United Kingdom abolished the death penalty for murder in 1965. A country looked at what its own courts had done, trusting a serial killer's testimony over an innocent man's desperate protests, and decided it could no longer afford to make mistakes that couldn't be undone. Strip it all the way down. Christie did not commit a perfect crime. He committed a mediocre crime in a grimy house with bodies buried so shallowly that children found the bones and a human femur propped up the fence. What he committed perfectly was a performance not of innocence, not of concern, not of friendship, but of authority. He performed the quiet, steady, reasonable man, and the system, the police, the prosecutors, the jury, the judge looked at him and saw one of their own. A man who had worn a constable's uniform. A man who spoke properly. A man who didn't raise his voice. And across the courtroom, the system looked at Timothy Evans and saw everything it distrusts: poverty, ignorance, inconsistency, anger. The verdict was not written in the jury room. It was written in the class structure of post-war Britain, in the reflexive equation of composure with honesty, in the bone-deep assumption that a man who looks trustworthy is trustworthy. Christie didn't fool the system. He was the system, and the system recognized him as such, and handed him its most terrible power, the power to point at another man and say him. That is the deepest kind of helping. Not helping the search, not helping the investigators, helping the prosecution, stepping inside the machine of justice and pulling its levers from within. And the thing that makes it almost unbearable is that the machine didn't malfunction. It ran exactly as designed. It simply couldn't conceive that the most composed man in the courtroom was the most dangerous one. So, a television doorstep in a small English town, a bar near a courthouse in California, a witness box in a London courtroom. 3 settings that could not look more different, but line them up and the same shape emerges. In each one, a killer moved toward the investigation, not away from it. In each one, the thing that should have marked him, proximity, familiarity, eagerness to help, became the thing that concealed him. And in each one, the qualities we are taught to trust: composure, warmth, respectability, were the exact tools used to dismantle the truth. We build our world on the assumption that help is safe. that the person who shows up, who volunteers, who stands in front of the camera, or buys the drink or takes the oath, is doing so because they care. Most of the time, that assumption is correct. These three cases are the exceptions, and exceptions are what test the rule. Huntley performed concern, and a reporter heard a wrong note. Kemper performed friendship, and the officers refused to believe the truth when he spoke it to them himself. Christie performed respectability, and the court hanged a man on the strength of it. The lesson is not that you should distrust every helping hand. That way lies paranoia, and paranoia helps no one. The lesson is smaller, harder, and more honest than that. It is that trust is not a fact. It is a bet. And sometimes the person who looks most like they belong in the room is the one who should never have been let through the door. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The 6 young women of Santa Cruz, Clarnell Strandberg and Sally Hallett. Beryl and Geraldine Evans and all the women sealed inside the walls of 10 Rillington Place. None of them were failed by a lack of suspicion. They were failed by the wrong kind of trust, the kind that asks how a person seems instead of what a person has done. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.